Lord Charles Cornwallis stood on the sandy banks of the York River and stared at the horizon. Not a single British sail broke the line of the Atlantic. 24 French warships anchored in the mouth of the Chesapeake Bay. The trap had finally snapped shut. His army of thousands was now effectively erased from the map. The most powerful navy on Earth had been locked out of its own colony. On August 30th, 1781, the horizon shifted. Admiral Francois-Joseph Paul de Grasse emerged from the mist with 24 ships of the line. The massive wooden vessels moved in a silent, coordinated arc. They occupied the narrow entrance to the Chesapeake Bay. The blockade became total within hours. Lord Cornwallis waited in his fortifications at Yorktown for a lifeline that would never arrive. General George Washington and the Comte de Rochambeau had gambled everything on this arrival. They marched their combined forces south from New York toward Virginia. Their strategy relied entirely on French control of the water. Without the fleet, their land army would be trapped against the sea. With the fleet, they held the keys to the entire conflict. The French warships dropped anchor and turned their broadsides toward the open ocean. Inside the bay, the water remained calm. The French sailors hauled heavy cables and secured their positions. Every exit route from the York and James rivers vanished. British supply ships from New York turned back at the sight of the French masts. Brigadier General Benedict Arnold watched from the Virginia shore as the blockade tightened. The British command structure in the north scrambled to react. Admiral Thomas Graves sat in his cabin in New York. He received word of the French arrival in the Chesapeake. He commanded 19 ships of the line. The math was already turning against him. He ordered the fleet to weigh anchor and sail south. The fate of the entire British campaign in the colonies hung on the speed of his hulls. The French fleet remained alert. Lookouts peered through telescopes at the southern horizon. The blockade was not merely a barrier, it was a cage. Cornwallis moved his men into position at Yorktown. He dug trenches into the red Virginia clay. He still expected a rescue fleet to shatter the French line. The silence of the Chesapeake was deceptive. The massive weight of the French Navy sat squarely in the path of any relief. Admiral de Grasse monitored the bay entrance with rigorous precision. He knew the British would come to reclaim the water. He prepared his guns for the inevitable collision. The strategic gamble of the American and French alliance had reached its point of no return. The morning of September 5, 1781, dawned with a clear sky over the Virginia Capes. Lookouts on the French flagship, the Ville de Paris, scanned the horizon for movement. They spotted the masts of the British fleet rising from the northern sea. Rear Admiral Thomas Graves approached the mouth of the Chesapeake Bay with 19 ships. He observed the French fleet anchored in the water ahead of him. The French ships sat in a disorganized state, caught by surprise at their moorings. Admiral de Grasse ordered his crews to cut their anchor cables immediately. The French vessels scrambled to exit the bay and form a coherent battle line. General George Washington and the Comte de Rochambeau waited on the land for the outcome. The success of their entire southern campaign rested on the maneuverability of these wooden ships. Admiral Graves saw the French fleet struggling to clear the narrow entrance. He chose to form a traditional line of battle rather than attacking the disorganized vanguard. This decision forced the British ships to maneuver into a rigid, predictable formation. The French fleet used the time to align their broadsides toward the advancing British. At 4 p.m., the first cannons roared across the water. White smoke billowed from the gun ports and obscured the view of the Atlantic. The ships drifted through the haze as they exchanged heavy iron broadsides. British officers signaled their intentions with flags that fluttered in the stiff breeze. Confusion rippled through the British line as the signals failed to communicate clear orders. Rear Admiral Samuel Hood, leading the British vanguard, struggled to interpret the commands. The French ships held their positions despite the intense bombardment from the Royal Navy. Splinters of oak and iron rained down onto the decks of the fighting ships. Sailors worked the heavy ropes and pulleys to keep their cannons leveled on the enemy. The air grew thick with the smell of sulfur and burning powder. Graves watched his tactical advantage dissolve as the French line maintained its integrity. The British missed their narrow window to scatter the French before they reached open water. Both fleets continued the exchange until the sun dipped below the horizon. Darkness brought a temporary end to the deafening roar of the naval guns. The two fleets remained in sight of one another throughout the long, tense night. The strategic stalemate left the blockade of the Chesapeake Bay firmly intact. Damage assessments began under the dim light of lanterns on the battered decks. The crews prepared their vessels for a potential re-engagement at first light. The naval collision had failed to break the French grip on the Virginia coast. The isolation of Lord Cornwallis at Yorktown grew more absolute with every passing hour. The sun dipped low against the horizon of the Virginia Capes. The roar of cannon fire echoed across the darkening water. Admiral Thomas Graves watched the British line from his flagship. He gripped the railing as the smoke drifted over the waves. The French fleet held its position with stubborn discipline. Admiral François-Joseph Paul de Grasse signaled his captains to remain steady. The British officers looked toward the French hulls through heavy spyglasses. Splinters of oak showered the decks of the Royal Navy ships. The HMS Terrible listed heavily in the rising swells. Its timbers groaned under the weight of incoming cannon fire. Men scrambled to patch holes in the hull with wooden plugs. Water poured into the lower decks through jagged breaches. The British fleet had failed to break the French formation. Graves maintained the rigid line of battle despite the mounting damage. The French ships stood firm against the incoming broadsides. Nightfall brought a sudden, hollow silence to the Atlantic. The flashes of musketry ceased as the two fleets drifted apart. Lanterns flickered on the battered decks of the British warships. Sailors worked in the dark to clear the wreckage of broken masts. The smell of salt mingled with the sharp scent of gunpowder. Graves reviewed the reports from his damaged vanguard. The HMS Terrible required constant pumping to stay afloat. He realized the opportunity for a decisive victory had passed. The French blockade remained firmly across the mouth of the bay. De Grasse kept his ships between the British and the coast. The isolation of Yorktown deepened under the cover of darkness. Lord Charles Cornwallis waited in his trenches for a fleet that faltered. British records later described the engagement as a tactically indecisive skirmish. The reality on the water suggested a different strategic outcome. Graves had not forced the French to retreat from their position. The French line endured the bombardment without breaking its formation. Both fleets spent the long night in tense proximity. They maneuvered cautiously through the shifting currents of the bay. The strategic stalemate favored the French naval presence. Every hour of delay tightened the noose around the British position. The Royal Navy had missed its narrow window to scatter the enemy. The ships of the line moved slowly through the light Atlantic swell. Neither commander ordered an aggressive maneuver to renew the battle. The French vessels maintained a defensive posture near the bay entrance. Admiral François-Joseph Paul de Grasse kept his ships between the British and the coast. The British crews spent the days repairing shredded sails and rigging. Sailors hauled heavy buckets of seawater to douse fires in the hold. The French fleet held the strategic advantage by refusing to engage. De Grasse waited for the arrival of the reinforcements from the north. On September 9th, the British lookouts scanned the horizon for signs of movement. The French ships adjusted their positions to guard the mouth of the bay. Graves maintained his formation but lacked the strength to break the blockade. The strategic isolation of Yorktown intensified with every passing hour. The French ships carried the heavy siege artillery required for the land campaign. This weaponry arrived in the bay precisely when the army required it. The British fleet remained at 19 ships of the line. Graves surveyed the combined French force from his position on the sea. He understood the numerical superiority of the enemy fleet. The opportunity to break the blockade had vanished completely. The French had secured the entrance to the Chesapeake. The heavy cannons destined for Yorktown were now safe within the bay. The Royal Navy lost its grip on the Virginia coast. The strategic reality of the war changed in a single afternoon. The French blockade grew into an impenetrable wall of iron and wood. The morning of September 13, 1781, dawned with a heavy mist over the Atlantic. Rear Admiral Thomas Graves paced the quarterdeck of his flagship. He observed the horizon through a weathered brass spyglass. The French line had grown to a massive formation of 36 ships of the line. The math of the engagement shifted beyond his capacity to overcome. His own fleet remained stunted at 19 operational vessels. The arrival of the Comte de Barras had changed the naval reality. Graves stood before his officers and reviewed the latest reports. The internal disputes between the British commanders simmered in the cramped cabin. Accusations regarding the failure to support the vanguard clouded the air. Rear Admiral Samuel Hood remained a point of friction within the command. The tactical errors of September 5th haunted the British staff. Graves looked at the maps spread across the heavy oak table. The strategic goal of relieving Lord Charles Cornwallis appeared impossible. He signaled his captains to break the formation. The British fleet turned its bows toward the north and New York. The sails caught the wind as the warships pulled away from the coast. This retreat marked the final abandonment of the forces at Yorktown. The decision to withdraw left the British Army without a maritime lifeline. British records later documented the intense scrutiny of the failed mission. Court-martial inquiries would eventually dissect every signal and maneuver. The officers argued over the missed chance to scatter the French. The reality remained that the Royal Navy had lost its grip on Virginia. Graves watched the coastline fade into a thin gray line on the horizon. The French fleet held the entrance to the Chesapeake Bay with total control. The heavy siege artillery sat securely on the French decks within the bay. These cannons would soon face the fortifications at Yorktown. The British retreat left the sea lanes entirely to Admiral de Grasse. No reinforcements from New York could reach the trapped garrison now. The isolation of Lord Charles Cornwallis became a permanent condition. The strategic failure of the Royal Navy sealed the fate of the campaign. Graves maintained his course toward the safety of the northern port. He left the Virginia coast behind to the encroaching French presence. The naval war in the Chesapeake ended with this silent departure. The noose around Yorktown tightened as the British fleet vanished from view. The siege lines tightened around the earthworks at Yorktown. General George Washington and the Comte de Rochambeau surveyed the enemy positions. The French siege artillery arrived safely at the harbor. Heavy cannons were hauled through the mud and positioned against the British redoubts. Lord Charles Cornwallis watched the horizon from his headquarters in the town. No sails appeared to break the French blockade of the Chesapeake. The British soldiers in the trenches rationed their dwindling supplies. British records would later describe the surrender as a tactical necessity. The official reports downplayed the naval failure to protect the garrison. They focused on the relentless pressure of the combined Allied batteries. The reality remained trapped in the harbor waters. The French fleet held the entrance with 36 ships of the line. No escape was possible for the thousands of men inside the works. On October 19, 1781, the British commander signaled for a ceasefire. Lord Charles Cornwallis surrendered his army to the combined Allied forces. The war for independence reached its turning point on that Virginia soil. The naval blockade had sealed the fate of the British campaign. The British fleet had retreated, leaving the coast to the French. History remembers the surrender as the end of the conflict. The sea lanes had dictated the outcome of the land war. You look at the map and see the thin lines of the blockade. You realize the walls were built not of stone, but of distance and isolation. The trap that held Cornwallis is the same one that waits for you. You are never as secure as you think, and the tide is already turning.